in the heart of Ironwood Valley, where the land stretches vast and unyielding beneath an endless sky. One man stands against the darkness creeping in from the edges. Benjamin Cole, once a ghost of war, a legend in battles that never made the news, now just an aging rancher with a past he never speaks of. But when the most ruthless cartel sets their sights on his home, they make one fatal mistake. They think he's just another old man. They don't know that beneath the quiet, beneath the routine of a farmer's life, lies something far deadlier. The first bullet fired in the dead of night is not a warning, it's a declaration of war. The cartel comes in waves, sending mercenaries, assassins, and an army of corruption to break him. But Benjamin is not a man who bends. He fights with the patience of a hunter, the precision of a soldier, and the fury of a man who has nothing left to lose. Every move is calculated. Every enemy that enters his land is marked for death. Now, the battle lines are drawn. Blood stains the earth, and the valley holds its breath. Will Benjamin survive the storm that's coming for him? Or will this be the fight that finally buries him along with his past? Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. Hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss a second of this high-stakes battle. Now, let's dive into the story. The sky stretched endlessly over Ironwood Valley, a vast expanse of quiet and solitude, where the wind whispered through golden fields and the mountains stood like ancient sentinels. Watching, waiting, in the heart of this land, Benjamin Cole sat on the worn wooden porch of his farmhouse, a steaming cup of coffee cradled in his weathered hands. He had seen too much, lived too long in the shadows of war. And yet, this was where he had chosen to make his final stand, not on some foreign battlefield, but here, where the soil ran deep and the memories even deeper. To most, he was just another aging rancher, the kind of man you nod to at the general store but don't linger long enough to start a conversation with. His neighbors, good folks, thought him quiet, maybe even a little odd, living alone with his old dog, Atlas, tending to his land with the same precision and discipline that once made him a ghost in the field of battle. They didn't know, and they didn't need to. He had spent 30 years of his life in places where men disappeared without a trace, where governments whispered names only in secret briefings. He had fought wars that never made the news, carried out missions that would never be acknowledged, and he had walked away. Or so he thought. The valley had been changing, slowly at first, then all at once. Old families, ones who had lived here for generations, were selling their land not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. Some were pressured, some threatened, and others simply disappeared. Those who stayed behind whispered about men in dark trucks, strangers knocking at their doors late at night, offering money at first, then something far more sinister when refused. Benjamin had seen the signs, the movements, the patterns. They weren't random. Someone was taking Ironwood Valley piece by piece, carving out a stronghold in the most unlikely of places. And now, they had come to him. He had seen them earlier, standing by the fence line, trying to act casual. Two men, military backgrounds, but soft, too confident, too accustomed to getting their way. He had read the signs in their posture, their movements. They weren't here to negotiate. Now, as the sun sank lower in the sky, turning the horizon to fire, a car pulled up his long dirt driveway, kicking up dust in its wake. A black SUV, tinted windows. They were making their move. Benjamin didn't reach for the shotgun by the door. Not yet. Instead, he took another sip of his coffee, set it down carefully, and stood, stretching as if he were just another tired old man watching the world turn. The SUV stopped. A man stepped out, smooth and sharp in a suit that didn't belong in a place like this. Felix Rojas. The name meant nothing to the people around here. But Benjamin knew better. He had seen the reports, heard the whispers. Felix wasn't just a businessman. He was a predator, the kind that didn't just take land, he took lives. Mr. Cole, Felix said, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Beautiful evening, isn't it? Benjamin didn't answer. Felix stepped closer, his men staying near the SUV, hands resting just a little too close to their belts. You have a fine piece of land here. Prime location. My employers, well, let's just say they see potential. We'd like to make you an offer. Benjamin's gaze didn't waver. Not for sale. Felix sighed, shaking his head as if he had expected this. Mr. Cole, I think you misunderstand. This isn't just an offer, it's an opportunity. A way for you to retire comfortably. Go somewhere warm, somewhere quiet. You deserve that, don't you? Benjamin said nothing. Felix's smile faded. He took a step closer. I've seen men like you before, he said, voice lower now, almost conspiratorial. Men who don't know when to let go, who hold on too tight. It never ends well for them. Change is coming, Mr. Cole, whether you like it or not. A long silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken things. Felix's men shifted impatiently. Benjamin let out a slow breath, as if considering, as if the weight of age and time had finally caught up with him. Then, he stepped forward, just enough that Felix could see the steel in his eyes. You ever see a wolf hunt, Mr. Rojas? He asked. Voice steady. Felix blinked, caught off guard. Excuse me? Benjamin nodded toward the fields. Out here, the wolves are smart. They don't just charge in. They wait, they watch, they learn your patterns, find your weaknesses. And when they strike, it's not loud, it's not messy. It's over before you even know it started. Felix smirked, shaking his head. Is that supposed to scare me? Benjamin's expression didn't change. No, it's supposed to warn you. For the first time, Felix hesitated. His men glanced at one another, sensing the shift in the air. Then, with a forced chuckle, Felix clapped his hands together. Well, Mr. Cole, I hope you reconsider. We'll be in touch. He turned, heading back to the SUV. But Benjamin knew this wasn't over. It was just beginning. As the car disappeared down the road, Benjamin exhaled, long and slow, then turned back to the house. Inside, he moved to the far wall of his study, pressed his hand against the wood paneling, and slid it aside. A hidden compartment revealed itself within. An old satellite phone, a well-worn map, and a pistol he hadn't touched in years. He picked up the phone, dialed a number he had hoped never to use again. A voice answered on the other end, rough with age but sharp as ever. Benjamin, they're here, he said. A pause. Then, the voice spoke again, low and deadly. Then it's time to remind them whose land they're standing on. Benjamin hung up, stepping back onto the porch. The valley stretching before him. The sky was darker now, the first stars flickering to life. The storm was coming, and this time, he wasn't running from it. The night pressed heavy against Ironwood Valley. A quiet darkness that carried the weight of something unseen. Something waiting. Benjamin Cole stood on his porch, the old wood creaking beneath his boots, his eyes fixed on the long stretch of dirt road leading up to his house. The stars overhead were sharp and clear, the way they only were in places like this, where the land stretched wide and empty. But the valley wasn't empty tonight. Atlas, his old shepherd dog, lay at his feet, ears perked. He could sense it too, the shift in the air, the silent promise of violence just beyond the tree line. Benjamin took a slow breath, steadying himself. His body had grown older, but his instincts had not. He had seen this before. In deserts and jungles, in cities where the war was fought in whispers rather than bullets. The waiting was always the same, the silence before the storm. His fingers hovered over the satellite phone resting on the porch railing. The number he had dialed earlier had been answered with only a few words, "We're coming." But he knew that was hours away. He had to hold until then. He turned, stepping back inside the house. The rifle was waiting for him on the kitchen table, oiled and ready, a relic from another life. A life that had never truly left him. He checked the scope, the magazine, his mind already moving through the numbers, the angles, the distances. Then, the motion sensors outside the barn blinked red. They were here. Benjamin moved like a shadow, slipping out the back door, into the cover of darkness. He had spent years designing his land not just for farming, but for defense. The layout of the fences, the placement of the outbuildings, everything was positioned to create choke points, to control movement. And now, the men coming for him were walking straight into his hands. He crouched low behind a stack of hay bales, lifting his rifle, the scope glowing faintly in the night. Through the lens, he saw them, two men, dressed in dark clothes, moving carefully but not carefully enough. They thought they were hunting, but they didn't realize they were being watched. They were armed, but not in the way trained men carried weapons. These weren't soldiers, they were hired guns, mercenaries, disposable. Benjamin exhaled, slow and steady. He didn't want to kill them, not yet. He adjusted his aim, squeezed the trigger. A single shot cracked through the night. The first man crumpled, his knee exploding under the impact. He went down hard, screaming, clutching his leg. The second man spun, panic flooding his face. "Drop it," Benjamin commanded, his voice cutting through the night. The man froze. His hand hovered over his pistol, shaking. "Don't," Benjamin warned. "You'll die before you clear the holster." The man hesitated, then, slowly, he lifted his hands. "Good," Benjamin said, stepping into the moonlight, his rifle still steady. "Now, tell me who sent you." The wounded man groaned, blood seeping into the dirt. The second man swallowed hard. "You know who sent us," he said. "Say his name." The man licked his lips. "Felix Rojas." Benjamin nodded. "Of course. You tell Felix," he said. "He made a mistake." The man's eyes darted to his wounded partner. "He'll send more." Benjamin allowed himself a small, grim smile. "Then he'll keep losing more." He motioned with his rifle. "Get him up, get in your truck, and don't come back." The man hesitated, then did as he was told. He hoisted his injured partner up, dragging him toward the vehicle parked just beyond the trees. Benjamin watched them go, the red taillights cutting through the darkness before disappearing down the road. He waited until the sound of the engine faded. Then, he stepped back toward the house. The phone was ringing when he walked in. He picked it up, a voice on the other end, low, steady, familiar. "You all right?" Benjamin nodded to himself. "For now. We're inbound. 6 hours out." "That's too long," Benjamin said. "They'll be back before then." A pause. Then hold. "We'll finish it when we get there." Benjamin hung up, staring at the reflection of himself in the darkened window. An old man, tired, weary but not beaten. Not yet. Outside, the valley stretched out, silent again, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of war. The morning broke slow over Ironwood Valley, light spilling across the land like an old memory trying to push through the weight of the night before. Benjamin Cole stood at the edge of his porch, watching the sun rise, but his mind was elsewhere, back in the dark. Back in the space between heartbeats where men lived or died depending on what they did next. He could still hear the gunshot, still see the fear in the man's eyes when he told him to leave. Atlas, his old shepherd, sat by his side, ears twitching at every sound. The dog knew something was wrong. Animals always did. Benjamin had been in enough fights to know that last night hadn't been an isolated test. Felix Rojas wasn't the type to be scared off by a single warning shot. No, men like him only understood two things: power and control. And when they lost control, they lashed out, hard. Benjamin exhaled through his nose, slow and steady. He wasn't just waiting for another attack. He was waiting for war. His phone buzzed on the porch railing, breaking the silence. He picked it up without looking at the screen. "You're still breathing," Sarah's voice came through, dry but laced with concern. "For now," Benjamin replied. "How bad?" "2 men, sent to scare me. One left limping, the other left knowing better." Sarah exhaled on the other end. "Felix won't take that lightly. I'm counting on it." A pause. "Ben, you need to leave." "No. God damn it. I leave. They take the valley." His voice was steady, the same voice he had used years ago when orders came down that didn't sit right with him. "I leave. They think no one will fight back. That's how it always starts. First, it's one man, then it's a family, then it's a whole town." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then, softer. "This isn't a battlefield anymore, Ben." He looked out over the land. The golden fields shifting under the breeze. The mountains standing firm in the distance. "You're wrong," he said. "It's always a battlefield. People just don't see it until it's too late." The first truck rolled in around noon. Benjamin was working the fence line when he heard it. The deep growl of an engine that didn't belong to any of his neighbors. He turned, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his glove, watching as the vehicle slowed to a stop on the dirt road leading to his house. It was a heavy-duty pickup. Black, spotless, the kind that didn't see much real work but wanted you to think it did. The driver's door opened first. A man stepped out, younger than Benjamin, but with the kind of weight in his posture that spoke of years spent in places most men didn't return from. He wasn't hired muscle. He was something worse, someone who believed in the cause he was fighting for. The passenger door opened next, and Felix Rojas stepped out, dressed in his usual expensive casual sleeves rolled up, top buttons undone, like he had just stepped away from a lunch meeting at a golf course. Benjamin rested his hands on the top of the fence post. Calm, steady. He didn't reach for his rifle. He didn't need to. Not yet. Felix smiled like they were old friends. "Mr. Cole," he called out, "you're a hard man to get a hold of." "I like my peace and quiet," Benjamin said. Felix nodded like he understood. "Yeah, I get that. I do." He looked around, taking in the land, the house, the mountains in the distance. "It's beautiful out here. Lot of history in places like this. You know, my father used to tell me that land like this, it holds onto things. Ghosts, memories, blood." Benjamin met his eyes. "You here to talk philosophy? Or are you here to make another mistake?" Felix's smile flickered, but only for a second. "I'm here to make things easy for you," he said. "I think we got off on the wrong foot. I don't want this to get messy." "Messy," Benjamin echoed. Felix sighed, like he was talking to a stubborn old dog. "You're a smart man. You know how this goes. I've been more than patient. This is my last offer." Benjamin didn't move, not interested. Felix's smile finally dropped. "Then you leave me no choice," he said. He turned to the man standing beside him. "Lucas." Lucas stepped forward, arms loose at his sides. But Benjamin could see the way his weight shifted. Ready. Prepared. "You ever hear about the old man down in Arizona?" Felix said casually. "Had a ranch a lot like yours. Didn't want to sell either. Then, one day, his barn burned down. A week later, some drifters showed up, trashed the place. Sheriff didn't do a damn thing. Couple weeks after that, well, accidents happen." Benjamin just looked at him. Felix sighed. "I don't want to do that, Ben. I really don't. But I need this land. So, one last time, take the money. Walk away. And live out your golden years somewhere nice. Or," Benjamin let the silence stretch. Let Felix think he was considering it. Then, he turned away, picked up the hammer he'd been using on the fence, and went back to work. Felix's hands clenched into fists. "This isn't over." Benjamin didn't look at him. "It never is." Felix exhaled through his nose, turned sharply, and walked back to the truck. Lucas lingered for a second, studying Benjamin, eyes cold and assessing. Then, without a word, he followed. The truck peeled away, dust kicking up behind it. Benjamin drove the nail into the post, the impact ringing sharp in the air. The first shot had been fired. And now, the real fight was about to begin. The night pressed heavy against Ironwood Valley, thicker than the last, carrying the kind of silence that wasn't natural. It was the silence of something lurking, something unseen, something waiting. Benjamin Cole felt it in his bones, the way a man who has lived through too many battles knows when another is coming. He sat on his porch, shotgun resting across his lap, eyes fixed on the tree line beyond his fence. The old wooden boards beneath his chair creaked softly as he shifted his weight. Atlas lay beside him, ears twitching, nose in the air. The dog knew it too. They were coming. Felix Rojas had left that afternoon with threats hanging heavy in the air. His patience finally spent. He had tried money. He had tried intimidation. Now, he would send a message. Benjamin had seen men like Felix before. He had fought them in different places, under different flags, but they were always the same men who took because they believed they had the right to. Men who destroyed because they couldn't build. And Benjamin had spent his whole life stopping men like that. He reached for the radio beside him, pressed the button. "Zane, you in position?" A crackle. Then the sniper's voice came through, low and steady. "North Ridge. Good sightlines." "Nothing yet." Benjamin nodded to himself. "Cyrus?" "Barnes rigged." Another voice responded. "Tripwires set at the south entrance. Motion sensors active. If they come in through the main road, we'll know before they do." "Sarah?" "Town's on alert," she said. Sheriff's still sitting on his hands, pretending this isn't happening. But the people who know better? They're ready. Benjamin exhaled slowly. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. He had spent years building his defenses not just for his land, but for his mind. War didn't just happen with bullets and bodies. It happened with patience, with planning, with the understanding that the man who could outthink his enemy was the man who walked away alive. And tonight, he intended to be that man. The first sign came just after midnight. The sensors in the west field blinked red. Movement. Benjamin lifted his binoculars, scanned the darkness. 4 men, moving in formation, not professionals, but not amateurs either. Felix had sent mercenaries ex-military. Maybe, but sloppy, too confident. They thought they were hunting a tired old man. They had no idea what they were walking into. Benjamin pressed the radio. Contact. Westfield. 4, maybe more. Confirmed. Zane replied. I got 2 more near the tree line. Looks like a flanking team. Benjamin nodded. That was the test. The real force would come once these men reported back that the coast was clear. He stood, moving quietly inside, where the walls of his house were lined with memories of another life. The weapons were there, too: his rifle, his sidearm, the knives he had carried through places most men never returned from. He strapped the pistol to his hip, slung the rifle over his shoulder. Then he turned off the lights. Let them come. The first man never saw it coming. He stepped over the fence line, past the tall grass, moving toward the barn. He was careful, but not careful enough. His boot caught the tripwire. The explosion wasn't loud, but it was enough. A flashbang bright enough to blind, loud enough to disorient. Benjamin was already moving. He stepped out from behind the tractor, rifle raised, and squeezed the trigger. One down. The second man turned too late. A single shot to the leg sent him to the ground, screaming. The third and fourth panicked, opening fire wildly. Bullets ripped through the wooden siding of the barn, shattering the night, but they weren't hitting anything. Benjamin was already gone. He moved like a shadow through the darkness, weaving between cover, forcing them to react, forcing them to make mistakes. Zane's rifle cracked in the distance. Another man dropped. That's 3, Zane reported. 4th is running. Benjamin exhaled. He let the last one go. Let him run back to Felix. Let him tell him what had happened here. Let him spread the fear. An hour later, the valley was quiet again. Benjamin stood by the fence, watching the horizon, the bodies of 3 men cooling in the night air behind him. Sarah pulled up in her truck, stepping out with a look of grim understanding. They're gonna come back harder, she said. I know, Benjamin replied. You can't do this alone. He turned to her. I'm not alone. Sarah looked at him, then past him, at the house, the barn, the land he had turned into something more than just a farm. She nodded. Then let's finish this. Benjamin turned back to the valley, to the darkness that still stretched ahead. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The bodies had barely cooled when the valley stirred again. Fear moved through it like an invisible tide, whispered from one porch to the next, passed between quiet nods in grocery store aisles. Ironwood Valley was changing, and the people who had built their lives here could feel it, even if they didn't yet understand it. But Benjamin Cole understood. He knew the rules of men like Felix Rojas. A show of force wasn't a warning, it was an invitation for something worse. The moment he had sent those mercenaries back in body bags, he had signed the next phase of the war. Felix wouldn't make the same mistake twice. He wouldn't send amateurs. He'd send killers. And Benjamin would be waiting. The sky had just begun to turn soft with the first light of dawn when the phone rang. Benjamin picked it up on the second ring. Yeah, they're coming. Sarah's voice was tight, urgent. 10 men, minimum, armored vehicles. We intercepted their chatter. Felix isn't playing around anymore. Benjamin exhaled. ETA? 40 minutes. Maybe less. That's enough. For what? For them to make their last mistake. Sarah hesitated, then said, You sure about this? Benjamin glanced out the window, at the land he had spent years turning into something more than just dirt and crops. I was sure the moment they knocked on my door. 30 minutes later, Ironwood Valley was no longer a quiet place. Benjamin's team had moved with precision, silent, fast, efficient. Zane was in position on the north ridge, rifle ready. Cyrus had rigged the access roads with surprises of his own. Sarah had gathered the townspeople, those who were willing to fight. This wasn't just about Benjamin anymore. Felix had underestimated the valley. He had underestimated the people who had built their lives here, the people who had bled into this soil, who had raised families under its sky. He thought this was about land. He didn't understand that it was about something far more dangerous. It was about home, and a man will kill to protect his home. The first armored truck rolled onto the main road at exactly 5:47 a.m., just as the sun broke the horizon. Benjamin watched from his vantage point, calm, still, waiting. He counted the men: 10, maybe 12, too many for a direct firefight. Good. Felix had brought an army. Benjamin had brought a graveyard. The first explosion sent the truck's front end into the air, flipping it like a child's toy. Smoke and fire burst into the sky as men screamed, scrambling for cover. Before they could regroup, Zane's rifle cracked once, twice, 3 times. The first man dropped without a sound. The second staggered before falling. The third didn't even have time to react. The survivors scattered, taking defensive positions, shouting into radios that no longer worked. Cyrus had jammed their signals the moment they stepped into the valley. They were blind. Benjamin moved through the wreckage like a ghost. Rifle steady, breathing slow and measured. He wasn't here for mercy. He was here to finish what they had started. A man rounded the corner of the burning truck. Weapon raised. Benjamin didn't hesitate. One shot. One more body on the ground. Felix Rojas had always believed in control. In fear. He had built his empire on the certainty that men would break when pushed hard enough. That money and violence were enough to bend the world to his will. But he had never faced men like Benjamin. Men who had already given everything. Men who had nothing left to fear. And as his men fell, as the valley turned against him, Felix finally understood. This wasn't his land. It never had been. And now, it never would be. The battle lasted less than 20 minutes. When it was over, Ironwood Valley stood untouched, unchanged, just as it always had. Benjamin sat on his porch, cleaning his rifle, watching as the last of the invaders were loaded into trucks, some dead, some wounded, none victorious. Sarah sat beside him, bruised but grinning. Think they got the message? Benjamin exhaled. Slow, steady. If they didn't, they're even dumber than I thought. She laughed, shaking her head. Jesus, Ben, you ever get tired of being right? He didn't answer. Instead, he looked out at the land, at the sky stretching endless and unbroken. And for the first time in a long time, he let himself breathe. The war wasn't over. But tonight, Ironwood Valley was safe. And that was enough. Dawn broke over Ironwood Valley. But it did not bring peace. The battle was over. But the silence it left behind was uneasy. As if the land itself had absorbed the violence, holding it beneath the soil, waiting for the right moment to spit it back out. Benjamin Cole sat on his porch, watching the first light spread across the fields. His hands were steady as he sipped his coffee. But his mind was elsewhere, tracing the echoes of gunfire. The weight of bodies hitting the ground. The smell of burning oil from the ruined trucks that still smoldered on the road. He had won, but victories like this never came clean. The dead didn't just disappear. And the living didn't just walk away untouched. The first call came before breakfast. Sarah's voice came through the radio. Tight and controlled. Felix is still alive. Benjamin set his coffee down. Where? Heading south. Looks like he's running. We intercepted a call. He's trying to cut a deal with someone outside the valley. Might be planning to regroup. Bring in more men. Benjamin exhaled slowly. Of course. Felix Rojas wasn't the type to let a loss stand. He was the kind of man who needed to prove he was still in control. Still powerful. That was his weakness. And Benjamin was going to use it. By noon, they had a location. A hunting cabin, 2 miles beyond the ridge. Felix had holed up there with what remained of his men, 4, maybe 5. They were licking their wounds, trying to figure out their next move. But they wouldn't get the chance. Benjamin had spent his life planning for wars. He had learned, long ago, that the worst mistake a man could make was letting his enemy stand back up. This wasn't about revenge. This was about making sure Felix Rojas never set foot in Ironwood Valley again. They moved fast. Benjamin, Zane, and Cyrus took the west approach, staying low in the tall grass. Sarah flanked east, watching the tree line for movement. The wind was in their favor, carrying the sound of the cabin's front door opening, men stepping outside, talking, unaware of the hunters moving toward them. Benjamin slowed his breathing. Every step was calculated, every movement controlled. This wasn't just another fight. This was the end. The first shot came from Zane. A single, quiet crack of the rifle. One of Felix's men dropped without a sound. The others scrambled, weapons raised, shouting into radios that weren't working. Cyrus triggered the first charge. The explosion rocked the ground, sending one man flying, his body landing hard against a tree. Benjamin moved in. The next few seconds happened in a blur: gunfire, the sharp smell of burning wood, the thud of boots hitting dirt. Then, silence. Felix was the last one standing. His gun was empty. His men were dead. And now, there was nowhere left to run. Benjamin stepped forward, rifle leveled. Felix backed away, hands raised slightly, trying to control his breathing, trying to find a way out of the inevitable. "You don't have to do this," Felix said, voice shaking just enough for Benjamin to hear it. "That's where you're wrong." Felix swallowed. "You're not a killer, Cole. You're just a man trying to hold on to something that doesn't belong to you anymore. The world's changing. You can't stop it." Benjamin didn't move. "No," he said, voice quiet, steady, "but I can stop you." Felix opened his mouth to say something else. Some last desperate attempt to regain control. The shot rang out before he could finish. Felix Rojas fell, the dirt drinking his blood, the earth taking him in. It was over. For real. This time. Benjamin stood there for a long moment, watching, making sure. Then, slowly, he lowered his rifle. Sarah stepped up beside him, looking down at the body. "You all right?" she asked. Benjamin didn't answer right away. He turned, glancing back toward the valley, toward the land that had nearly been lost. It was still there, still standing. So was he. For now, that was enough. He took one last breath of the morning air, then walked away. The earth had swallowed Felix Rojas. But Ironwood Valley did not return to peace. It never did. Not really. The wind still carried whispers of gunfire. Even though the battle had ended, the fields still held the weight of footprints, though the men who made them would never walk again. And Benjamin Cole, he sat on his porch as he always did, watching the land he had fought for, knowing that even in victory, something had been lost. Sarah stood beside him, her arms crossed, gaze distant. She hadn't spoken much since they left the cabin, since Felix's body had hit the dirt and the last echoes of gunfire had faded into the hills. She was thinking the same thing Benjamin was. Killing a man doesn't end a war. It just makes room for the next one. "You think it's over?" she asked finally. Voice quiet. Benjamin exhaled, slow and steady. "It's never over." Sarah turned, looking at him, waiting for more. He didn't give it to her. Not because he didn't want to, but because he had lived long enough to know that the truth wasn't something you said out loud. It was something you carried. It was something that settled into your bones and stayed there, waiting. The sheriff came by just after noon. His truck rumbled up the dirt road like it had all the other times he had come to warn Benjamin about making waves. This time, though, he didn't step out with the same forced authority, the same bureaucratic weight behind his words. He stepped out like a man who knew he was walking into a conversation he couldn't win. "Ben," he said, tipping his hat. Benjamin nodded. The sheriff hesitated, then sighed. "State police are looking into the incident up near the ridge." "That's so?" "Yeah." He rubbed the back of his neck. "They're saying it looks professional." Benjamin said nothing. "You know anything about that?" the sheriff pressed. Benjamin took a slow sip of his coffee. The sheriff sighed again. "Damn it, Ben. People are talking. They know something happened out here. They know you had a hand in it. People know a lot of things." Benjamin said evenly. The sheriff studied him, waiting. "This is your warning. If anyone comes asking questions, you keep your mouth shut. You understand me?" Benjamin met his eyes, calm as ever. "Always do." The sheriff stared at him a moment longer, then nodded, turning back toward his truck. Before he climbed in, he paused. "I don't know what you did, and I don't want to know. But I do know these things don't just disappear. Ben, they leave marks. And if you ain't careful, one day someone's gonna come looking for those marks." Benjamin watched him drive away, watched the dust settle behind his tires. And for the first time in a long time, he wondered if the sheriff was right. Maybe some ghosts never really stayed buried. The valley was quiet that night. Too quiet. Benjamin stood on his porch, looking out over the land, feeling the weight of something he couldn't quite name. Atlas sat beside him, ears twitching, sensing it too. Sarah had gone back into town. Cyrus had retreated to his shop. Zane had gone back to the ridge, but Benjamin? He stayed, because something about the silence didn't feel right. It wasn't the peace of a battle won. It was the silence before something else. Something worse. And in his gut, in the part of him that had spent a lifetime fighting, he knew this wasn't the end. It was just another beginning. The night stretched long over Ironwood Valley, deep and impenetrable, the kind of darkness that had weight, that held the past like an open wound. The battle was over. Felix Rojas was dead, his men, buried or burned, But the valley did not forget. Benjamin Cole sat in his usual place on the porch, a rifle resting against the railing, his coffee gone cold in his hands. He hadn't moved in hours. Hadn't slept, either. He was waiting. Not for more of Felix's men, they wouldn't come. Not now. Not after what had happened. The cartel, if they were smart, would cut their losses, pretend Felix had never existed, erase his name from their ranks as if he had never drawn breath. No, Benjamin was waiting for something else. Something he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the weight of it all settling into his bones. Maybe it was the knowing. Because he had learned, long ago, that a man doesn't get to walk away clean. He had fought wars in places most Americans couldn't find on a map. He had seen men kill for causes they didn't understand, die for men who didn't care about them. And every time, when the dust settled, there was always something left behind. He thought, once, that this would be different. That home would be different. But war was war, no matter where you fought it. And every war had a price. Sarah pulled up just after midnight, her truck rolling to a stop at the bottom of the drive. She didn't get out right away, just sat there for a moment, like she was trying to decide whether or not she wanted to have this conversation. Then, finally, she stepped out, boots crunching against the gravel, hands shoved deep in her jacket pockets. "You look like hell," she said. Benjamin smirked. "Feel worse." She sat down on the porch steps, looking out over the land. Sheriff's still cleaning up the mess. He's pretending like nothing happened. But we both know he's waiting for the next thing to hit his desk. Benjamin nodded. "And it will." Sarah turned to him. "You think the cartel will come back?" "No," he said, shaking his head. "Not like this. Not loud. Not guns blazing. But they'll come back." He exhaled slowly. "They always do." Sarah didn't argue. She knew better. "So what now?" she asked. Benjamin was quiet for a long moment. Then, "We rebuild." Sarah huffed a laugh. "That easy? Huh? Nothing's easy," he said. "But this valley? It's still ours." She studied him, searching his face for something. Maybe hope, maybe peace. She wouldn't find either. "Ben," she said, softer now, "you know it doesn't have to be like this, right? You don't have to spend the rest of your life waiting for the next fight." Benjamin didn't look at her. "Maybe." She let out a breath, shaking her head. "You're impossible." He finally met her gaze. "Still here, though." She smirked. "Yeah, still here." The next morning, the valley looked the same. The sun rose over the mountains. The fields swayed in the wind. The land stretched on, as it always had, indifferent to the blood that had been spilled upon it. Cyrus was already at the barn, assessing the damage. Zane was up on the ridge, watching the horizon like he always did. The town was waking up, moving forward, pretending like the last few days had never happened. And Benjamin? He stood at the edge of his land, hands in his pockets, staring at the road that led out of Ironwood Valley. He could leave. He had no ties here, no family, no reason to stay. But he wouldn't, because this place, this quiet, violent, beautiful place was his. And for now, that was enough. For now, he would hold the line. For now, he would stay. And if the world came knocking again? Well, he'd be ready.